The first stone struck her ribs, a dull bruising impact that sent a tremor through her body. The second slammed into her cheekbone, splitting the skin and leaving a hot trail of blood dripping down her jaw. By the fifth, Azara was barely upright, her knees buckling against the rough stone beneath her. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and smoke, carrying the acrid scent of whatever foul substance these primitives burned in their crude torches. Their voices rose and fell in a rhythmic chant, a brutal, almost ceremonial cadence that matched the slow, merciless pelting of stones against her body. She could taste iron in her mouth, blood her own. She knew this moment would come ever since they had dragged her into their wretched village, her wrists bound behind her back, her body stripped of armor and dignity. She had seen it in their faces, the fear, the rage, the savage hunger for destruction. They didn't understand her, nor did they care to. To them, she was an outsider, an invader, a threat, a traitor. That word still burned, though not from the mouths of these people. No, it burned because it had come first from her own kind. Azara forced herself to stay conscious, though her body ached to surrender to the black void creeping at the edges of her vision. She needed to think, needed to remember how she had ended up here. The mission, the order, the moment she defied it. Her people, the Vari, were a highly advanced race, masters of technology, pioneers of the stars, and yet for all their intelligence, they were no less cruel than the primitives who now stood in a circle around her, jeering and throwing stones. She had refused a direct command, an extermination order. They had sent her here as part of a scouting operation, studying the development of the native species. Derry had done this countless times before. Observe, record, analyze, and then inevitably judge. If a species was deemed insignificant, if they lacked the potential to evolve into something of value, the decision was simple: eradicate them before they could become a threat. Azara had watched the people of this world, had studied them. Yes, they were primitive, violent, ruled by superstition and fear, but they were also something else. Resilient, adaptable, capable of change. She had argued against the extermination, begged her superiors to reconsider, and when that failed, she had taken matters into her own hands. She sabotaged the operation, destroyed the relay beacon that would have sent the final signal to her fleet, delayed the judgment, bought this world time. For that, she was branded a traitor. Her own people had cast her down, sending her to the very creatures she had fought to protect. A message, a warning. This is what happens to those who defy the Vari. Another stone struck her temple, and she swayed, pain flaring white-hot behind her eyes. The crowd roared. She clenched her fists, the bindings cutting into her skin. Her breath came in ragged gasps. She would not break, would not plead. A deep voice rang out over the chaos, and the stones halted midair. The village elder stepped forward, his wrinkled face set in a mask of grim determination. His robes were adorned with bones and feathers, his long, gnarled staff etched with symbols of their gods. He spoke in the rough, guttural language of his people, and the warriors beside him stepped forward. One of them carried a stone larger than the rest, the killing blow. Azara stared at it, feeling an odd sense of detachment. Would it be quick, or would they draw it out, reveling in the slow extinguishing of her life? The warrior lifted the stone high above his head. A sharp metallic snap echoed through the air, then a scream. The warrior jerked violently, a thin, dark object embedded deep in his throat. He staggered, choking, blood spilling down his chest. The stone slipped from his fingers and hit the ground with a heavy thud. For a moment, there was silence, then chaos. The villagers scattered, shrieking in confusion. Some reached for weapons, others dove for cover. Azara barely had time to register what had happened before another figure moved through the crowd, swift and deliberate. A gunshot cracked the air. The elder crumpled to the ground. Azara's vision blurred, her mind struggling to catch up. Then suddenly, he was there. A man, tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in dark, weather-worn fabric. His face was partially covered by a cloth mask, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the chaos with the precision of a soldier. A rifle rested against his shoulder, modified and well used. Human. Her breath hitched. She had heard rumors of them. Wandering nomads, mercenaries, survivors, ghosts of the fallen colonies that had once dotted this sector before the Vari had deemed them unworthy. Most had perished. A few had disappeared into the void, lost to exile. And yet here he was. The human strode toward her with purpose, unflinching in the midst of the screaming villagers. He reached her in seconds, dropping to one knee. A knife flashed in his hand. Azara flinched, instincts flaring despite her exhaustion. But he didn't attack. Instead, the blade slipped between the bindings on her wrists. With a swift motion, he cut her free. Her arms fell limply at her sides, blood rushing back into her fingers in sharp, painful tingles. The human reached for her again, this time to lift her, but she recoiled on reflex. He hesitated, his brows drawing together in a frown. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, him crouched before her, Azara swaying unsteadily against the stone pillar. Then, slowly, he extended a hand. A choice. She looked at it, breath uneven. The village behind them was still in chaos, but it wouldn't last. Soon the warriors would regroup. Soon they would come for her again. She had no other option. With the last of her strength, she took his hand. His grip was firm, steady. Without another word, he pulled her up, adjusting her weight against him. Then he turned, rifle at the ready, and they ran. Behind them, the village roared in fury. The hunt had begun. Azara's world tilted violently as Callan pulled her through the dense undergrowth, his grip firm but not unkind. The sharp scent of damp earth and alien flora filled her nose, mingling with the coppery tang of her own blood. Her vision swam, her body sluggish from pain and exhaustion, but instinct pushed her forward. She could hear the chaos behind them, the enraged shouts of the villagers, the frantic pounding of feet as they scrambled to organize a pursuit. Callan moved with purpose, weaving through the twisted roots and thick foliage like he had done it 1,000 times before. His movements were quick, deliberate. This wasn't blind escape. He had a plan. Azara had no choice but to trust him. Her legs threatened to give out, the strain of her injuries dragging her down like dead weight. She stumbled, barely managing to keep herself upright. Callan noticed. Without breaking stride, he adjusted his grip and pulled her closer against his side, supporting her without a word. "Keep moving," he murmured, his voice low, edged with urgency. His accent was strange, his tone rough, but his words, asterisk asterisk as language asterisk asterisk, was human. The realization hit her through the fog in her mind. A human. An actual human. She had studied them once, long before her exile. They were the remnants of a forgotten war, a scattered and broken people who had once built civilizations that spanned across the stars. Duveri had wiped most of them out before they could become a true threat, and those who survived had vanished into the void. Refugees, stragglers, ghosts, and yet here he was, flesh and blood, and she was running for her life beside him. The underbrush thinned ahead, giving way to jagged rock formations. Callan took the incline with ease, his boots finding footholds in places Azara could barely register. She tried to follow, but her balance was failing her. Her limbs felt detached, foreign, like they belonged to someone else. She barely made it halfway up before her knees buckled. Callan was there before she could hit the ground. He caught her with a swift, practiced motion, then exhaled sharply. "You're not going to make it much farther like this," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Azara tried to shake her head, tried to insist that she could keep going, but the words never formed. Her body had already made the decision for her. With a resigned breath, Callan crouched and lifted her in one fluid motion, slinging her over his shoulder like she weighed nothing. Azara tensed, her instincts screaming in protest, but she didn't have the strength to fight him. She could hear his heartbeat, steady and unshaken, beneath the layers of fabric and armor he wore. It was strangely grounding. "This will be easier if you don't pass out," he said, adjusting his hold. "Just a little farther." Azara gritted her teeth, forcing herself to stay conscious as he carried her over the ridge. The descent on the other side was steep, leading into a narrow ravine shrouded in shadow. The ground here was uneven, slick from recent rain. Vines clung to the rock walls, their thick, bioluminescent veins pulsing faintly in the dim light. A hidden pathway, one that the villagers in their blind rage would likely overlook. Kalen moved fast, his breath steady despite the added weight. He didn't hesitate, didn't falter. He knew exactly where he was going. By the time they reached the bottom, the sounds of pursuit had faded, swallowed by the dense jungle behind them. Kalen pressed forward for another mile, ensuring distance before finally slowing. Only then did he stop, lowering Azara onto the ground with surprising care. She swayed but managed to remain upright this time, bracing herself against the rock wall. Kalen crouched beside her, pulling a small canteen from his belt and holding it out. "Drink." Azara hesitated, eyeing him warily. He sighed. "If I wanted you dead, I wouldn't have just carried you through half the damn jungle." "Fair point." She took the canteen, lifting it to her lips. The water was stale, metallic, rationed, stored for survival, but it was water. She swallowed greedily, her throat burning as it finally received the relief it had been denied for far too long. Kalen let her drink before pulling the canteen back. "Not too much at once," he warned. "You'll make yourself sick." Azara exhaled shakily, leaning her head back against the stone. Her body still ached, her limbs weak, but the fog in her mind was beginning to lift, enough for the questions to come flooding in. She turned her gaze to him, studying him properly for the first time. He was tall, broad-shouldered but lean, his clothes layered for both protection and practicality. His face was partially obscured by the cloth mask he wore, but his eyes, asterisk, sharp, calculating, undeniably human, were watching her just as carefully. "What?" Her voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. Kalen tilted his head. "Why? What? Why save me?" For a moment, he didn't answer. Then he leaned back against the opposite wall of the ravine, rolling his shoulders like he was deciding how much to say. "Didn't like the odds," he said finally. "One unarmed woman against a whole village seemed unfair." Azara narrowed her eyes. "That wasn't the whole truth. You don't know who I am." He gave a half shrug. "Didn't really have time for introductions. You don't know what I did." His gaze didn't waver. "Do you deserve to be dead?" The question caught her off guard. She opened her mouth, but no immediate answer came. He nodded as if that was answer enough. "Didn't think so." Azara studied him, searching for something in his expression, mockery, deception, anything that would explain why a lone human had intervened in something that had nothing to do with him. She found nothing. Who was this man? Why was he here, alone, on a planet that should have swallowed him whole? He was a mystery, but right now, he was also her only chance at survival. She exhaled through her nose, rolling her shoulders as she tested the strength in her arms. "We can't stay here." "Wasn't planning to." Kalen pushed off the wall, reaching for his rifle. "Come on. We need to move before they figure out where we went." Azara hesitated only a moment before following. Whatever came next, one thing was certain. Her fate was no longer in the hands of the Vari, nor was it in the hands of the tribe that had tried to execute her. For better or worse, she was now in the hands of a human. Azara moved through the dense jungle with slow, measured steps, her muscles aching with every movement. The damp air clung to her skin, heavy with the scent of wet earth and decaying foliage. Even without turning, she could sense Kalen a few steps ahead, his boots barely making a sound against the uneven ground. He moved like a predator, purposeful, alert, entirely at home in this wilderness. The wave of exhaustion pressed down on her, a constant battle against the survival instincts that had kept her alive for this long. Her body was still raw from the beating, her ribs throbbing from the stones that had struck her earlier. Every breath felt tight, sharp, but stopping wasn't an option. Callan hadn't said much since they had left the ravine. He had barely glanced at her, his focus instead fixed on the terrain, scanning for threats. Azara didn't mind the silence. She wasn't ready to talk either. The jungle stretched out endlessly before them, thick and overgrown, a tangled mess of bioluminescent vines and towering trees. Strange sounds echoed through the underbrush, the distant shriek of some unseen creature, the rustling of massive leaves shifting overhead. The ground beneath them was slick, treacherous, forcing them to pick their way carefully through the tangled roots and patches of deep, sinking mud. Azara had been trained for survival. She had spent years studying hostile environments, analyzing terrain, memorizing strategies, and yet nothing about this place felt familiar. The humid air made her lungs burn, and the gravity here, slightly heavier than what her body was accustomed to, pulled at her limbs, making each movement feel sluggish. She could still hear the distant cries of the villagers behind them, far off now, but persistent. They weren't giving up. Callan suddenly raised a hand, signaling her to stop. Azara froze, watching as he crouched low, pressing a hand to the damp ground. He was listening, feeling. After a few tense seconds, he gave a short nod and rose. "They're moving away from us," he muttered. For now. Azara studied him carefully. He had no scanner, no equipment to track movement, just instincts honed by experience. That, more than anything, confirmed what she had already suspected. This man had been surviving out here for a long time. She didn't ask how long. She wasn't sure she wanted to know. They continued moving, pushing deeper into the wilderness, until the thick canopy overhead blocked out nearly all traces of the planet's twin moons. Azara's body screamed for rest, but Callan showed no signs of stopping. He didn't even seem winded. Her frustration finally reached a breaking point. "How much farther?" she asked, her voice rough. Callan didn't look back. "Couple more miles." She scowled, flexing her stiff fingers. "We should stop." "I can't." She cut herself off, hating the weakness in her voice. "I need to rest." Callan slowed slightly, then exhaled as if debating whether or not to argue. He finally turned, scanning her in the dim light. His eyes flicked to the way she was favoring her right side, the sluggishness in her movement. He knew she was close to collapse. Without a word, he veered off the path and led them toward a thick grove of trees. A few minutes later, they emerged into a small clearing near a shallow stream, its surface reflecting the eerie blue glow of the surrounding plant life. "This will do," he said, setting his rifle down against a nearby tree. Azara didn't waste time. She lowered herself onto the damp ground, leaning against a moss-covered rock, willing her body to stop trembling. Callan knelt by the water's edge, filling his canteen. "You're going to need to eat something," he said over his shoulder. Azara closed her eyes for a moment before responding. "I'll be fine." That's not an answer. She exhaled sharply, but she didn't argue. She knew better than to ignore basic survival needs. Still, her stomach churned at the thought of food. Callan rummaged through a small pack at his waist and pulled out something wrapped in old cloth. He unwrapped it and held it out to her. Dried meat, tough, slightly charred. Human food. Azara hesitated. Very physiology was different from human biology. Her digestive system could handle a wide range of proteins, but that didn't mean it would agree with her. She met Callan's gaze. He was watching her carefully, his expression unreadable. He had saved her life, carried her through the jungle, and now he was offering her food. She took it without another word. The first bite was harder than expected, her jaw aching as she chewed. The taste was strong, too salty, but not entirely unpleasant. It would do. Callan seemed satisfied with her choice to eat, turning his attention back to their surroundings. He was constantly scanning, his posture relaxed but alert. Azara swallowed another bite before finally asking the question that had been lingering since the moment he had cut her free. How long have you been here? Callan didn't look at her. Long enough. Alone. His fingers twitched slightly against the strap of his rifle. That was answer enough. Azara studied him for a moment. He wasn't he wasn't a native, which meant he was either a survivor from one of the old human colonies or something else entirely. What about you? He asked, shifting the focus. What the hell did you do to make those people want you dead? Azara's fingers tightened around the dried meat. She chewed slowly, deliberately, buying herself time. She could lie. She could tell him she was just another exile, another outcast lost in the galaxy. It would be easier than explaining the truth. But Callan had already saved her life once, and out here, honesty was a rare currency. I stopped a war, she said finally. Callan's brows lifted slightly, the first real sign of curiosity he had shown. Azara leaned her head back against the rock, exhaling. At least I tried. Silence stretched between them. Callan didn't press for details. He didn't question her further, didn't demand an explanation. He just sat there, watching the jungle, the quiet hum of unseen creatures filling the space between them. Azara wasn't sure why, but that silence was more unsettling than interrogation. She finished eating and wiped her hands against her torn clothing. Callan tossed a small cloth toward her, and she caught it with reflexes that surprised even herself. Get some sleep, he said, standing. I'll keep watch. Azara hesitated. You trust me enough to sleep with me still here? Callan's lips quirked slightly. Not really, but if you were planning to kill me, you wouldn't have waited this long. Azara huffed, shaking her head as she stretched out against the rock. Her body still ached, her mind still raced with 1,000 unanswered questions. But for now, exhaustion was stronger than paranoia. Her eyes grew heavy, the rhythmic sounds of the jungle blending with the steady breathing of the human beside her.